desktop. The technical optimization part of speeding up a WordPress site is not for the faint of heart, and sometimes it can sound a little too techy for some people, and they'll step away and run away screaming because they think only the IT eggheads could ever understand what all this stuff is. So my challenge right now is to help make this make a lot more sense to you. Technical optimization of WordPress means understanding a few core concepts. The first one being web server configuration and what that means for a fast website. The second is the concept of caching and how that speeds up your website loading as well. And the third is code minification or minimization. This allows you to have a lot less gaps in code. It's kind of like the version of shorthand, but for computer language. That's going to make sense very shortly. Let's get that started. First of all, let's look at your web server software. If you were watching the earlier part of this series where you were seeing what PHP is and all that, this is a bit of a refresh. But for those of you who are very new to the idea of what web server software is, particularly when it comes to how that relates to a WordPress site loading quickly, well, then I've got a bit of a treat for you. First of all, we look at the web server software as being controllable by you and by the web host. So the web host will control the server's operating system. They'll control the web server software, which will be explained very shortly as well. And they have control over the versions of the MySQL database, or more recently, the MariaDB database. So it's a different version of MySQL, which is much more efficient and loads faster, particularly on, it's going to sound like gobbledygook, Nginx and Lightspeed servers. The things that you have control over when it comes to your web server software is the version of PHP, which is the language that is used to load your website. You've got control over that. Now, it's usually defaulted to the most recent supported version, or if you're using something like crazy domains, gosh, they've got it down to like much earlier versions, and you have to manually go in there and update it yourself, even if they've got the most recent version, which half the time they don't. Then it comes down to you controlling also your WordPress version. So if you're using WordPress 4.8, you're way out of date. If you're using 5.2, 5.3, you're in a much better position. And then you also have control over the versions of the plugins and the themes that are used on your website. The things that make you able to do more things on your website is your plugins, and your themes are the things that make your website look good. Your website theme might be a page builder like Divi or Elementor as well. So all these things are things that you have control over. If we want to understand how the web server software that you don't have control of works out, we think about Linux, which is what they all run on. They work on a version of Linux, and we'll look at what those versions are and which versions are better and how to look out for those versions when it comes to a couple of slides forward. But think about it, your computer, it runs on either Windows or Mac OS, or you might have Linux running, but very few people do. Linux tends to power the web servers of the world. So it's a customizable, free, open source piece of software that's running what we call distributions or distros. Those distributions are different versions of Linux that different people have developed for different purposes. And we'll go through what some of those versions are that you want to be able to look out for if you're looking for really top quality, fast serving WordPress loading. Then it comes to the things that you would have on that computer that equate to what we call the web server software. So think about these as pieces of software like Microsoft Word or Google Chrome that allow you now to do something more than just open up a computer and work on it. You then want it to be able to open up to the world and serve web pages. And so the first one and the biggest used one, mostly because it's been around the longest, is Apache, which is that feather icon you can see there. Now, all of these web service softwares are kind of based upon the Apache principle, but Apache is not very popular anymore for running a lot of web hosts, particularly commercial web hosts that work with small businesses like you and I, because it's got limitations that slow it down and it stops it from being able to really effectively make like shared hosting environments like A2 hosting and Bluehost and HostGator and GoDaddy and all those. So what we find these days is the web server software is mostly Nginx or Lightspeed, and both of them are much quicker and much more capable of serving much more data and website traffic than Apache is. Then finally, in our stack, our web development stack, we're using then the languages, and the languages are things like HTML, JavaScript, and PHP. So what does this all mean? You've got to then look out for what your web server or your web host has in terms of what server operating system are they using? What web server software are they using? And what languages are they using? And which are the very best versions of those, particularly when it comes to the server operating system? It's got dozens of options. Web server software has got a few options as well. For WordPress site loading, we've got a few recommendations I could make for you. First of all, when it comes to the server operating system, which runs on Linux distributions, versions of the Linux operating system, the good versions are Debian, Mageia, ClearOS, and Oracle Linux. They're all very good. They work very, very competently, but the most modern and best versions and the ones you'll find much more constantly deployed on web servers is Ubuntu, Red Hat, SUSE, and CentOS or CentOS, just CentOS it gets called most of the time. Ubuntu and Red Hat and CentOS particularly popular. Ubuntu is probably the most distributed Linux web server software in terms of serving through really good software. So most WordPress are going to go through Ubuntu or CentOS, and some more expensive ones might use Red Hat, which is particularly good for enterprise web serving for very large scale systems and very big, very busy websites. When it comes to your web server software, look for these names. Apache is good and Light TPD are good, but even better is if you can find out whether your web host uses Nginx or Lightspeed. The reason why Nginx and Lightspeed are there is because the amount of things they can compute at the same time and serve through is way, way higher than Apache. Light TPD is approaching Nginx and Lightspeed, but it is a very, very light version of a similar thing to Lightspeed. It's not a full version, it's kind of a light version. So it does load things very quickly, but it's particularly good at loading what we call static files, not dynamic files like WordPress sites that use a content management system. So we're serving very plain HTML websites. Light TPD is amazing at that. Apache is good at all these things too. But if you really want the fastest possible service and the fastest possible loading of your website, you really have to look towards things like Nginx and Lightspeed to deliver those. Then when it comes to PHP, it's pretty good to run your website at 7.3 version of PHP as at this date, which is December 16, 2021. It is still the supported version, but better is the upcoming supported version, which is already in the wild and probably the most used version of PHP, which is 7.4. But next year, get ready for version 8, which comes with immense speed improvements. When we first went from version 5.6 to 7.0, there was a fundamental change in the speed of websites and what they could handle with Joomla websites, WordPress websites, Drupal websites, any websites that were hosted on these Linux systems. What we found was that websites that maybe took 12 seconds to load were now loading in 5 seconds. The improvement was just dramatic, just from the version of PHP that was used. The problem was, though, that not all applications on your WordPress website, your plugins, your themes were made to work on that version. So I would say if you can move to version 8 now, do it now. But if you've got lots of old stuff and your website was built in lots of custom setups by particularly offshore, I won't call them sweatshops, but offshore developers who have made a lot of custom changes to your website, I would say hold off and stick with 7.3 or 7.4 if you possibly can. I've even seen versions of these websites that could not be updated beyond version 5.6, which is just plain dangerous. So if this is what I always say, don't use offshore call centers and offshore developer centers that are going to custom build everything. Everything needs to be built off the shelf in WordPress in order to make it updatable by you, maintainable by you, and understandable to the next person here in Australia who's going to be looking at the back end of your website and helping you out with it. Caching is another beast altogether. You've probably heard the term, or we might call it caching or caching, as they might call it in America. The caching is, I guess, a way to make sure that reserves are there to deliver your site in the fastest possible way. It's the storage of website files in a handy, temporary place that's nearby in case you visit again soon. And this speeds up your return visit. Now, caching is done by two things. The first one is browser-based caching. Browser caching stores a version of your website files on the person's computer who visited it. So they visit the first time, all that gets downloaded to their browser and then stored there. So that if you're then moving around their website to various places, you go back to the home page, you're not having to reload that home page from scratch all again. You get a copied version of it that sits on your browser that loads instantly. So if you had to sit through 15 seconds of loading nightmare when you first went to their website before you could use it, the second time you go to that home page, you're not going to get that problem because that version of that website's now not coming from all across the internet. It's coming just from your computer. So it will load really, really quickly. And this works on a thing called time to live. A time to live setting is set by the web host and set by the person who owns the website to say, how long should you keep a version of my website on? If you are news.com.au or the local newspaper website, you want that time to live to be very, very short because you want people to get the news updates as they come through, as they keep going back to that site. But if your website doesn't really change that much, you'll find it's generally defaulted to 1 hour, which is 3,600 seconds. I would say there's even a better way to look at it. I would say a time to live, for instance, for most websites is probably more like a day or a week or a month because things don't change often. But when they do change, and someone goes there for the first time, they'll get that new version. But don't worry, even people who have had it cached in their browser tends to have the browser cache dumped every 30 days anyway, so they're going to get the new version regardless. The second kind of caching is called content delivery network caching. And this stores your website files closer to your visitors than where your web server is located. Remember before I was talking about Cloudflare and bunny.net and Jetpack? This is exactly what those services do. They take a copy of your website, which might be sitting in the Ukraine, and it's now got versions of it in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, in Europe, in anywhere where there's people, there's now a copy of that website in that location. This means that there's less need for a person visiting your site to wait for all the downloaded files to come down from Ukraine. They're now getting it from Adelaide, or they're getting it from Brisbane, or from Perth, or from Melbourne or Sydney. Much more efficient, much faster load your files. But if you don't have this content delivery network, it's almost like every time someone goes to your site, they're downloading fresh versions of your files all over again, which doesn't help your bandwidth allowance with your web host and does not help your visitor at all, because this is the difference between a website taking 12 seconds to download and taking 3 seconds to download. That's the difference you're talking about when you take all those files and locate them more locally to where people are. In Australia, bunny.net and Cloudflare and Jetpack all have server locations in Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra. They may, in some case, think bunny.net also has Hobart or Launceston, so it makes it a bit easier for Tasmanian audience as well. None of them, unfortunately, have a location in the Northern Territory, though that could very much change with two major international data cables coming into Australia and companies like Rackspace setting up brand new server infrastructure and NextDC setting up large-scale server farms in the Northern Territory to take advantage of that connectivity into Australia through Darwin's new pipes. So that's great to know all that information. What do you choose when it comes to those? For browser-based caching, you can choose plugins such as Lightspeed Cache, WP Rocket, which is absolutely brilliant, W3 Total Cache, and WP Super Cache. All four of those options are amazing, and I would encourage you to use them. But when it comes to the CDN caching, the caching that happens before people even get to your own website, then Jetpack is a free option, which I think everyone should use. I've found actually Jetpack CDN to be faster in the free version than Cloudflare's, and Cloudflare is excellent. But Bunny CDN is a phenomenal product and is paid, as is Security, but they have lots of built-in extras like Cloudflare that have the ability to block people from denial of service attacks on your website. It blocks a lot of malicious traffic at the source, doesn't let them ever even see your website. And in some cases, these CDN also help in security matters to keep people from even seeing your website if they're in certain countries that you don't want to serve. If you only want people within Australia to see your website, you can tell all of these services, except for Jetpack, so Bunny, Cloudflare, and security to block all other countries other than Australia. This can really help you to hide from those hackers coming out of Eastern Europe and Russia and China. So it's really useful for that. Code minification is the final step we'll look at in the technical side of speeding up your website. Code minification is basically like, no, it's not coding. You don't have to worry about this. We're not going to tell you to code anything. It's just in your plugins. Jetpack does it. Cloudflare does it. A lot of those like Lightspeed and WP Rocket, WP Supercache, WP Simple Cache, all of those plugins have this version of shorthand, which is taking all the gaps and all the additional words and text and code and squishing it down to the most efficient use of that. Now, will this make your site faster? Look, it's not necessarily going to do that. It means less requests for files required. It means less load time slightly, but it doesn't really make the page work all that much faster, particularly when you're using a CDN. What it does do is show Google that you are technically capable of running a lean, mean fighting machine of a website, and that it's built to best serve people who are looking for search results, to best serve the humans who are actually wanting to view those sites in the first place. But all these little changes, they do add up. So the ability to be able to add code minification for JavaScript, HTML, PHP, and then go and add a cache in front of it using maybe Jetpack or Cloudflare, and then also adding in a lot of the principles we've looked at previously, which are to do with the on-page optimization. All those little one-pointers, they add up to make a much better situation for you. My recommendations for an easy setup, use Jetpack because it's just a plugin that you set up yourself. And WP Rocket will increase the speed of your website in a significant way. But to get the best value out of this, I've found that the best products I've used to speed up websites on WordPress is to use the business version of Cloudflare. It costs about $25 a month and gives you tons of different resources you can turn on and try to speed up your website so much more. And WP Rocket or Lightspeed cache are both very good to use in the back end of your WordPress website to speed it up. So takeaways from this section is choose a better web host. You get what you pay for. Don't choose cheap web hosts because they're cheap. Implement some browser caching by using things such as WP Supercache or W3 Cache or whatever those different ones are. Use a content delivery network, even if it's a free one like Jetpack. It will increase your page speed. It will make your pages load faster. And if you spend a little, you can gain a lot. $25 a month is not going to break the bank. I think even bunny.net is even cheaper than that. So if you can use those services to speed up your loading time, it can have a dramatic effect. Now, what you can expect as a result of all this is that you can have a website that can load much faster. That's obvious. But we want that website to load much faster. How much faster are we looking at? If your website loads in 5 seconds, that's good. Anything over 5 seconds is bad. Sorry to hear it. If you're loading in 12 seconds, you need some surgery on that site. Better is about 3.5 seconds. That's a lot better than 5 seconds. But if you can get your website loading in under 2 seconds, you're really doing the right thing. Now, my front page of my website loads in 1.3 seconds. That to me is incredibly important because that's loading my information in a quicker, faster way for people to be able to see it sooner and be able to consume it and get the information they need. Your HTML page size, if you see this in your stats, if you're about 40 kilobytes, that's pretty good. 33 kilobytes is probably the gold standard. But man, if you can get your sites to under 30 kilobytes, I got mine at 29 at the moment, then you've got the best possible position for your website to grow and be seen more. So basically, how does it work? What is the real effect of, say, a reduction of a website that used to load in 7.5 seconds to 1.3 seconds. And what's that done for me? That's exactly the thing that happened to me. I had 7.5 seconds of loading for my homepage. It now loads in 1.3 seconds. That's all great and fine. What has it actually meant, though, in the real world? Well, you'd be surprised. You'd think it would be not even this big, but 95% more web traffic visitors from when I had the 7.5 second page load to now 1,200 visitors to my website every week, a digital marketing agency website. Crazy, right? What it means is 79 keywords that I wanted to aim for in my particular website are now in the top 20 search results. So I've got 79 items that show up in the top 20 for different keywords that I wanted to target. And 32 keywords of those are in the top 5 search results. So naturally, I'm getting a lot more traffic than I used to get before. Is it the right traffic? Yes, traffic is traffic, because it leads to 90% more inquiries. 90% more inquiries. How would your business go with that? 90% more inquiries coming through. That's conversions. For me, conversions are mentioned of people who are going to sign up for a product. And that has meant 480% increase in conversions. Speeding up your website isn't just good for people to read it. It actually makes business sense.